story streaming on Appaloosa Radio Online, produced in collaboration with the Sacramento Suburban Writers, by award-winning writer Thomas Hessler. Norte. An episode extracted from his fictional work based on adventures and experiences at White Sands Missile Range, New Mexico. In the spring of 1945, scientists, engineers, and Army personnel huddled in the chilly pre-dawn near Trinity Site at the White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico. At 5:23 a.m., technology and its sophisticated contrivances forced hunks of uranium-238 violently together to form a critical mass. The resulting nuclear reaction brought premature brilliance to the pre-dawn desert, along with a force that made the gods tremble. The world felt that force and saw the light, if not actually, then ultimately. Thereafter, White Sands and Los Alamos were synonymous with secret technology and the intrigue that goes with it. The activity at White Sands continued to involve convergence of other critical mass. Shortly after the Big Bang, German scientists and their playthings, trainloads of V-2 missile parts that had been accumulated from post-war Germany, were brought to White Sands to advance the art and science of rocketry via launchings at Bunker 92. Steadily, not always slowly, a technological locus emerged in the alkaline desert. More engineers and more scientists, schooled in Western universities, employed in Ivy League laboratories, were transplanted from those fertile gardens of scientific nutrients to thrive as steadily and as sturdily in the desert, nourished by the hell-bent race for sophisticated weaponry and the race to the moon. In the early 1960s, John Kennedy declared that we, the United States, would be foremost in technology, and that we would beat the Russians to the moon. He had the means to acquire and to spend the money in order to make his promise stick. Hundreds of companies that had formerly made cars, airplanes, or sewing machines were now engaged in developing secret technology and demonstrating the results to the military or to NASA, usually in the desert where it was difficult for adversaries to pry, and where an errant missile or two would be unlikely to create great havoc. In those days, engineers and scientists were highly valued, a commodity bartered, traded, and stolen from rivals to provide the stock from which technical marvels would mature. Graduate engineers enjoyed enviable starting salaries and were exhilarated to be part of the great race. However, the military leaders, even though lavished with a pipeline of money, were not oblivious to available economies. Those responsible for developing our armed might and the moon rides reasoned that many of the same engineers who were graduating and going on to provide fresh technical minds for the military technology contractors were A, of draft age, and B, either unmarried or married without children, and C, a hell of a bargain at draftee wages. No matter that the military continues to maintain that the Selective Service is random, thousands of newly graduated engineers, scientists, mathematicians, and those who had attained other technical skills found, in a very short time, that their workaday clothing color of choice, no choice, actually, was army green. Yes, White Sands was the place where rocket things were happening. And in 1963, I was steadily making my way east from California. Destination, Desert Outpost. I had been drafted into the U.S. Army and had endured 8 weeks of basic training at Fort Ord, emerging from the training a hardened fighting unit a trained killer with 8 hours of instruction in hand-to-hand combat. However, the Army hierarchy had shrewdly determined that it would be to the advantage of the USA if the remainder of my 2 years would be spent in service of our country at the technical Mecca on the desert, White Sands Missile Range. I had to sign a document in which I agreed I would work as an engineer for peanuts. What if I don't sign it? There's always advanced infantry training. White Sands Missile Range, WSMR, is a huge tract of land, a rectangular patch that takes an alligator bite out of southern New Mexico. The south border of the range is 30 miles north of El Paso. The northern is 60 miles south of Albuquerque, allowing a missile shot of about 100 miles if you shot from one end to the other. And we're fortunate enough to have the missile land on the property. If you look at a physical map of New Mexico, you would spot an area roughly bounded by mountains, including a huge area in which no rivers flow, Jordana del Muerto. Perfect. If we were to pick an area in the continental United States where one might test a bomb of uncertain force in utmost secrecy and not level or contaminate too much of civilization, this location would be the ultimate. White Sands. Proving Ground was created in 1943 for this express purpose. White Sands Monument, with its blinding dunes of white sand, lies, not exactly safely, in the lower east section of the range. It is for these white sands that the range is named, as you might guess. The current base is at the southern end of the range, allowing close access to the cities of El Paso and Las Cruces. Many of the workaday civilians spend their non-working time in these two oases. Although the base is military, its missions are highly dependent on civilians to provide an extensive complementary technical force and all the other force that the military would rather have someone else provide. The military personnel come and go, while the civilians provide the continual thread of experience and capability, the platform from which the work is done. Note that the name of the facility was changed in the 1950s from White Sands Proving Grounds to White Sands Missile Range, ostensibly to reflect a more accurate picture of what was actually going on. It is possible that the name changers wondered actually if the word proving might be a bit strong. When one is suddenly transformed from a somewhat understandable, somewhat routine civilian life to a complex technological environment. There are many things to learn, alien procedures to follow, and enigmatic puzzles to solve. One such puzzle directly relates to the episode that follows, and it puzzled me for some time until I pieced together the background and intent. One can't be on the property at the White Sands base for very long before one encounters the ubiquitous message, "English is the official language at White Sands Missile Range." The message seems innocent and perhaps unworthy of much further thought, but the background was much more significant than one might imagine. I shall explain. Before I arrived, the work had evolved from that first test of the atom bomb to the testing of the German V-2 rockets, and then to rockets that the U.S. designed and built, made in USA. After the war, the U.S. acquired Germany's V-2 rockets, 300 railcars worth, complete with the German scientists, engineers, and technicians who had coaxed the technology along, initiating this world's serious entry into space technology. The V-2 was a lethal weapon used at the end of the war, the Big War, to terrorize the British. It may have been quite easy to choose WSMR as the perfect arena in which to assemble the V-2 parts and to shoot them off, much as a boy will shoot off fireworks, standing mesmerized by the display. Therefore, although White Sands couldn't have expected to achieve success as a permanent location to test nuclear pyrotechnics, it continued as the premier landscape on which to launch experimental rockets. When testing rockets at the facility, the general idea is that the missiles can be launched at the southern end of the range, fly over the highway between Alamogordo and Las Cruces, and impact to the north in the desolation of the upper range. And they usually do. Yes. Shooting from south to north is shooting away from the crowd being El Paso and Juarez and all those folks living there. To fire in the other direction would be risking it. Once upon a time, after the Second World War, when we were shooting the V2s, we had an experience in firing in the opposite direction. In other words, from north to south. It was 1948. The V2 team assembled at White Sands consisted of the German scientists, local help, many of whom spoke Spanish as their first language, local gringo help, whose only language was English, and a mixture of other nationalities who had found their way into the U.S. technical arena via the Fermi Project or work at Los Alamos. The result was a virtual Tower of Babel of languages. On a sunny day, in this part of the country they are all sunny, the team was to fire a V2 from south to north, as had been done many times before. As a part of the shoot, the rocket was programmed to rise vertically immediately after ignition, and then to heel over, under power, into an attitude that would affect, more or less, horizontal travel. Horizontal travel is necessary as there is little more useless or hazardous than a rocket launching straight up and then falling straight down. You can imagine, as part of the process, it is necessary for Scientist A to instruct Scientist B or Helper B to perform those acts, which result in the rocket taking some direction or another, hopefully the direction which has been chosen. On this particular sunny day, something was lost in translation. Instructions were given, we must assume, but as they involved the routine abbreviations that develop over time, hand-waving, and little more than pointing in one direction or another, technical requirements and directions spoken in German to English to Spanish did not translate with precision. We do not know where in the chain the miscue occurred, but suspect it was English to Spanish. The rocket launched at precisely 0800 hours. It rose vertically for the intended 7.3 seconds before it started its heel, translating to a trajectory 43 degrees from the horizontal into a precise 11.3 second burn before the rocket engines expired, the rocket now heading south. South. Oh shit. This particular remark was spoken simultaneously, in precision, and in at least 5 languages. An international expletive, if you will. All they, the assembled they, could do was watch and wonder. Innocently, to the south, basking relatively peacefully in the morning sun, nestled El Paso and Juarez. A technical solution, calculated for the horizontal distance, speed, and direction, correcting for the Earth's curvature and rotation, but not wind, would place the V2's impact somewhere in Greater Juarez. Shit. Double shit. An international incident. Visions of a vengeful and resurgent Mexican army descending on a United States, weakened by the war effort, troubled the minds of many. Some of the more cool technical heads were interested in the outcome and verification of the rocket's travel, as affected by the Earth's rotation, when firing south at this latitude. Others were more concerned that the V2 might hit something or someone. Those were probably the Spanish-speaking crew members who might have left something or someone on the other side of the border. Several officers stole a glance at the polished rank on their shoulders, anticipating less impressive future insignia. It was a while before they found out what had happened. I mean, who does one call in Juarez to find out where your rocket hit? Of course, WSPG Range Control was notified, 5th Army Headquarters was notified, and the State Department, all within 10 minutes of the incident. The incident? Now, what it was being called. Responsible officers made an awkward attempt to call somebody in Mexico. However, Army officialdom had a difficult time finding the right folks to talk to and the right words to explain to the folks that, while you have been fired upon, it was not intentional. And by the way, did we hit anything? Army officialdom which, for once, having it clear as to who in the executive branch handled international incidents, had called the State Department. This retrograde maneuver became known as the handoff. Those involved in the wayward launch actually heard about the results through the very unofficial but somewhat prompt Juarez commercial radio station. Some of the Spanish-speaking civilians at the site intuitively knew that their fastest and closest ear to anything that happened in Mexico was through this medium. In 1948, this was via a car radio, which from the vantage point of the launch site was able to pick up the broadcast of an excited Spanish newscaster. Spanish can be spoken relatively fast when one is not excited. Under more intense circumstances, the words per minute rate is awesome. Agitation erupted amongst those Mexicans and those Spanish-speaking U.S. citizens listening to the radio in the 46 Ford, a staff car parked in the vicinity of the launch. The rocket landed in the Juarez cemetery. Chaos reigned. The rocket did not have an explosive warhead, but for those who heard more than observed, the rocket whistle in an impact amongst some fairly ancient crypts, headstones, monuments, and what have you. It would have been hard to convince them that something supernatural had not just happened. Finally, those in proximity to the rocket's crash raised their heads which had recently been under protection from flying fragments and shelter from a potential Armageddon. They then assumed the kneeling position from whatever position they had just emerged, and gave thanks for once again having had their pitiful souls saved from a calamity that was probably just. After about 5 minutes, fear gave way to curiosity, as it so often happens amongst the humans on this planet. Also, you can only kneel in prayer for so long on fragments of granite. Slowly, the dust cleared, and seeing no other apparent cause for danger, those in the vicinity slowly stood up and approached the crater. The V-2 had not disintegrated into itty-bitty bits and pieces. It had survived the impact, still looking very much like a rocket. Also, because it was a German rocket, it still had the German inscription on it, a language that was recognized by more than one Mexican citizen who had served abroad, and by several U.S. citizens who had finished their adventure in the war, the Big War, on German soil. For some time, the reaction was one of incredulity. The several who had seen the Germans defeated knew it couldn't possibly be true. Yet here was a recently fired German rocket at their very feet. It didn't take long for the mumblings of those few who recognized the German hieroglyphics to be reinterpreted by the crowd into an attack by the Germans. No matter how sophisticated or unsophisticated you might be, overwhelming evidence at your feet is hard to ignore, and few would blame the rapidly swarming crowd for the hysteria that resulted. Some ran for shelter away from the cemetery. Some just ran. For sure, no one had the right answer. More damage was done to humans in the resulting melee than had been done to humans, living or dead, by the inappropriate appearance of the rocket. It wasn't long before news of the calamity reached the offices of the Juarez radio station. The journalists were not sure they understood the volatile barrage from 6 frantic intruders, all yelling at the same time. The bare understanding, communicated in that first instance, was that Juarez was under rocket siege by the German army, which, no matter what you might have heard, was able to escape its bondage to hurl its might against, of all places, Ciudad Juarez, in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. In the initial broadcast, you could hear a touch of pride in the rapid and somewhat hysterical voice of the newscaster reading from the scribbled notes that were handed to him by trembling hands. To think, the broadcaster's inflections seemed to indicate, the Germans have picked this very strategic target Ciudad Juarez, as the first priority to knock out upon their resurgence. However, regardless of the pride, there was plenty of hysteria left over in the voice of the communicator to concern many folks. Those in the Army's higher ranks, hearing the interpretation of the broadcast at the launch site, knew that the worst chore ahead of them would be to get the word out, the real story of the incident, via some quick means of dispatch. The second phase of that quandary would be to get people to believe the real story before they hurt each other. Fortunately, nobody who had not been dead prior to the impact suffered any injury, but some of the long-term cemetery residents would never be the same. There was some property damage, hurriedly paid by the good offices of the U.S. government, and of course, the newspapers had a great time with clever banner headlines. Headlines that, in addition to enticing hundreds of thousands to read the article below, served to embarrass the Army and numerous branches, agencies, and bureaus of the U.S. government, which could be easily thought to look responsible. It was horrible. Our space technology was set back years. The incident was the major reason for it, no matter what you might have read in the right stuff. Involved civil service personnel at White Sands were relegated to newly assigned and mortifying minor tasks. Army officers lost rank, never regained. The sequestered German scientists had to suffer imprudent remarks, having a mean central theme relating to, "No wonder you lost the war." In time, however, involved civil service personnel retired. Career Army officers were assigned duty stations elsewhere. Very remote vistas, we suppose. Yet, there remain today 2 reminders of the incident. One is not so subtle. At the Cementerio de Ciudad Juarez, one can pay 15 cents in 1965 dollars to see where the German rocket impacted. A feature not mentioned in the Juarez Chamber of Commerce pamphlet. Ciudad Juarez, what to see. The other reminder is only such if you know the story. It is very subtle indeed. In steel, in plastic, in neon, in paint, on the sides of buildings, on billboards and bulletin boards scattered throughout the facilities at WSMR, is the admonition. English is the official language at White Sands Missile Range. There you have it, folks. The boiled-down reason, the inescapable common denominator, the homogenized, pasteurized reason for the screw-up. The Mexicans didn't understand English. In the incident, not only did the Mexicans occupy the bottom of the high-tech totem pole on those early operations, but they also had the misfortune to have had the rocket impact in a country in which they were associated. The admonition was an ill-disguised defense against any further retribution the Mexican government might suggest. Any hint at such adventuring, and it would be quickly pointed out that any Mexican help, even thinking of technical assignments, should know English, at least well enough to know north from south, when a German scientist says, "Shoot this way."
This original audio story was created using voices from 11 Labs and music from Suno AI, neither of which is covered by copyright privilege. However, the story content is wholly original and thus has privileged ownership rights, including full copyright under the provisions of the United States.